Welcome to the Black Cop Podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to offer our listeners a dual perspective of members of the Black community who also serve our community as law enforcement officers through thoughtful discussion, debate, and articulation of facts with some reasonable opinions. Our communities are struggling to coexist, and I hope this podcast can serve as a bridge to help reconcile these two communities. You are the king. Yeah, I love that. King of the class. Man, take your crown, king.
You should not have some kind of blanket immunity.
When law enforcement officers break the law, they should be held accountable.
To the extent that qualified immunity fosters a sense of, it's really not my problem. Let's take a look at it.
What's going on, bro?
What's going on, brother?
How
are
doing?
you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Good. Good day.
Good day.
Yes,
New
sir.
day.
New day.
You know, it's a very popular subject that we're about to talk about right now.
Yes, sir. It's a little heady, a little deep.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me just welcome the listeners.
Sir.
Thank you all for joining us. This is the Black Cop Podcast.
Yeah, getting a lot of good feedback.
Man, look,
I really appreciate it.
It gives me life. You know
Yes,
what I mean?
sir.
Because at the end of the day, that's the goal is for
Yes,
people
sir.
to feel like they can walk away having more an understanding and therefore more power and how to utilize their power as citizens in your community.
That's right. Y'all keep that feedback coming, please.
Yeah, please do. Please do. Because I think that, like, you know, as we continue to improve, like, you know, CVC,
Yes, sir.
I mean, you sound great right now.
Hey, yeah.
And
I'm loving it. Loving it.
Got the new mic, got the new mixer. So, you know, hopefully it definitely makes a difference. And so, yeah, you know, I think that I think we as a community rely on each other. Like, you know, if I need to know something about the healthcare profession, I want to hear from the healthcare providers.
That's
and if
right.
I need to know, and if you guys want to know something about law enforcement, come talk to us.
We are the place for you to come.
Come check us out.
That's right.
And so thank you all for joining us. You could have been anywhere else in the world, but you're here with us. And so we are grateful for your presence and your time. Today, we're going to be talking, I'm C-Dub and this is CVC. And today we're talking about qualified immunity. We're going to talk about qualified immunity, of course, but let's lay out, first of all, the law that is going to change and have an impact on qualified immunity.
Right.
So as some of us know, after the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd,
Right.
the Congress, the House put together a bill that is called Justice and Policing, the Justice and Policing Act of 2020. This bill is going to, if passed, is going to make major changes to law enforcement.
Changes to law enforcement.
And it may all seem admin like, but I think it's really important for us to go over the impact of this Justice and Policing Act, and if it's passed. And so we're going to go over a bit of a fact sheet before we delve into qualified immunity.
Right.
Let's just go over some of the things that this is going to change. So the basic four premises that they're going to address are the national standard for operating in police departments, mandating data collection for police encounters, reprogramming and funding that will tie in more community-based policing programs, and then streamline federal law to prosecute excessive force and establish independent prosecutors for investigations. That's just the 4-point summary. There are a lot of things that are going to happen. The goal of this is, of course, they're trying to end, racial profiling. They're trying to make racial, religious, any discriminatory profiling they want to provide training for, and then they want to require law enforcement to collect data on these activities.
And make sure that the law is being followed and that people are not being profiled.
Yes. Yes, and I think that like I cannot, I cannot tell you how many times, because some states have passed this law of collecting data
Right.
to determine whether or not the officer's activity in police encounters. That in and of itself has a tremendous impact
Mm-hmm.
on citizens.
Mhm.
An officer now has to indicate pretty much anything that he would write, or he or she would write in a traffic summons, the name of the person, where that person lives, where he conducted the traffic stop, where he saw the offense, he or she saw the offense, the race of that person,
Mm-hmm.
the gender of that person,
Mm-hmm.
the age of that person.
Right.
Now you're specifically collecting a data profile to that one particular officer.
Right.
So if that said officer pulls over only
Hispanic
Hispanic
females. Yeah.
then now we have data to show that they have some type of
A
focus, a
Right.
propensity towards that particular group.
Mm-hmm.
And now we might not be able to explain everything, but
Right.
we will know that it has a significant impact on our ability to to provide training or counsel as to why a particular group is being experiencing more traffic enforcement or criminal enforcement from that said officer.
Right.
I mean, I can't even just officers knowing, right, that they have to document. An officer may choose, hey, that headlight's out. I might just blow the horn at that person and tell them
Right.
to cut their lights on.
Right.
In the past, you could just, without that, you could just pull them over, you know what I mean? But now, because you have to that changes a lot.
The documentation changes a lot because you're spending more time on that one, what officers might feel minute thing,
Mm-hmm.
because you have to document what you're doing and why.
Oh, and that's another thing. And, now you can't just say, you have to actually not justify, but you're actually providing reason for your stop.
For your
Your
stop.
your reasonable suspicion,
Right.
which is, so for just to explain, reasonable suspicion is when an officer is led to believe that a criminal act is, or just occurred.
Right.
And that's different from probable cause. Probable cause is a higher standard.
Right.
That's when an average citizen who would believe that a criminal act is, or is about to occur. And then you have beyond reasonable doubt, which is pretty much, there's almost like 99% in an ideal situation. And that's just scientifically ruling out that there was no other person or no other cause to commit this crime but this defendant in this courtroom.
Right.
So we're talking about every time an officer stops the car on a traffic stop, or detains a person who's walking in the street, is based upon reasonable suspicion.
Right.
So before an officer didn't have to document their justification.
Mm-hmm.
I really, without repeating myself, I'm telling you that even if the law just passed that,
That specific.
even if it was just
part.
that one thing that
Right.
required all the departments in order for them to receive federal funding,
Mhm.
which a lot of times takes care of their tactical equipment, their marine patrol equipment, maybe helping with vests, just grants for community policing programs, the money.
Right.
You're attaching the money to that.
Mhm.
That changes. Now you have evidence. Now you have documentation to show the trends that the police department has.
Mhm.
So of course they're talking about that. Now the obvious things are banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants. I think I don't think that requires much explanation. Limit military equipment to American streets and requiring body cameras. I am all for requiring departments to have body cameras. I'm 100% on it. I look, at the end of the day, like I said before, it's helped us more than it's helped people in the past. And I think it's helped us more than it's hurt us.
Mhm.
And I believe that and we're in a situation now, in order to restore the trust in the police department, it's going to have to be a trust but verify. However, when it comes to military equipment, to be honest with you, there are a lot of militia groups.
Yeah.
There are a lot of individuals who have more firearm and ammunition than the police
Right.
departments.
Yeah.
And so yes, I do not like seeing these items deployed or visibly present when people are peacefully protesting
Right.
and standing up for their rights,
Mhm.
or like I don't want them to be used as items of intimidation.
Right.
I don't think that citizens should be attacked or treated like they are an opposing foreign country or land. But the reality of it is that there are officers right now who don't have rifles in their cars.
Right.
And there are citizens right now who have multiple
rifles.
And they have them in
rounds of
their
ammunition. Yeah. Yeah. So I know a lot of people that I talk to say, oh my God, why do you all need that type of equipment on these city streets? I don't want to see a tank rolling down my street. I mean, that's just a sample. You're not really
No, I
going to
get
see
it.
a tank.
It's
rolling down the street.
called a Bearcat.
Yeah, you're gonna
and
see-
it's a bulletproof truck.
Right.
That's pretty much what it really
Mhm.
is. And I'm sorry to cut you off there,
That's okay.
but the bulletproof truck makes it so that the safer I feel, and the less likely that I am in danger,
Mhm.
the less likely that I have to use lethal force to protect myself.
Right. So, getting back to what I was saying, a lot of people that I know will ask, why do you all need that type of equipment?
Yeah.
Well, and I always use the analogy of David with Goliath.
Mm. Take them to the church.
David had a slingshot and a rock.
Yeah.
You know,
5 slew stones.
That's right. Against, that big opposing force.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to feel like David, going against Goliath.
Not at all.
But at the same time, like C-Dub was saying, I don't want to use this equipment as something where I'm going to try to make you do
Correct.
something because I have this equipment.
Correct.
I want to be more defensive
Right.
than offensive.
Correct. It's with guardianship in
That's
mind.
right.
Not with advancing on your territory and your land in
Right.
mind. It is,
Mhm.
and now granted, yes, we'll get to this point, but what's more important than trying to limit the equipment is creating standards
Mhm.
that will govern how the equipment and when the equipment is
Is
used.
used. Right.
And in another podcast, we'll have to go into the different forms of standards that departments utilize and what to look for in your department. If you live in the city right now, I'll tell you straight up right now, instead of waiting until the podcast, I'm not going into detail about it because
Right.
I feel like that we'll get off subject.
Right.
But if you live in the city right now and your department is not CALEA accredited, ask questions.
Ask questions. Yes.
CALEA is a international standardization for policing.
Mhm.
They provide the accreditation for the academy. They provide accreditation for the communication/dispatch program, and they provide accreditation for the law enforcement body, the department.
Mhm.
They require that between the PERF, Police Executive Research Forum, between Sheriff International, between Noble, the National Organization for Black Law Enforcement Executives, Major City Police Chiefs, ICPA. I mean, these organizations come together
Mhm.
and say, you know what, through all the research and science we've done and through our works with the DOJ, we are putting together the best policies for departments to go by.
These standards
Mhm.
that a police department has to adhere to.
Yeah.
Standardization.
So if you go to a city and the police
Mhm.
department's policy manual is 8 pages, get out.
That's a problem.
Get
That's
out.
a problem.
Get out. Because now you're pretty much saying, oh, we're winging it.
Yeah.
They're not looking up case law before they walk to, go to their next call for service. So, I think that is very critical. You got to wonder if you have, it's CALEA, CALEA, CALEA. Is very important. Look them up on Google. Now, a lot of what you see going on right now is a lot of cities or state criminal justice systems are now trying to make their standards in line with CALEA.
Mhm.
To try to avoid having to go to that high. They'll adopt most of them, but not all of them kind of thing. And CALEA is going to reduce a department's chances of getting sued,
Mhm.
reduce the department's chances of having poorly trained officers and having officers carrying out poor procedures and protocols. And it's going to require an accountability system
Right.
in the department for officers who have demeanor or procedural conduct complaints. But now let's go back to get back to the big fish that we're going to deal with today. And so this may not be as long of a podcast for the simple fact that explaining quality immunity is going to sound like I'm giving you a legal debrief. And I don't know, y'all ain't tuning in for no legal debrief. So I'm, we're going to definitely, keep it short. But the their goal of changing qualified immunity is to make it easier for police officers to be sued in civil suits for matters of misconduct,
Right.
police misconduct. So let's go through this. Let's go through qualified immunity. So let me just say, in short, before I give you a little bit of a longer explanation, in short, qualified immunity is the equivalent to a business LLC. Just like in your own business,
Right.
when you start your business, you're going to have your personal property protected.
Mm-hmm.
You can sue the business, you can sue the business address, you can sue the business workers.
Right.
But you register for an LLC because you want to make sure that your personal effects, that my home, where my kids, my family kids live,
Mm-hmm.
my car, my home address, my personal bank account, you want those protected because at that point you're taking on risk and starting a business. You can't promise perfection.
Right.
Well, the government equivalent of the LLC is the qualified immunity, in the sense where you can sue the government,
Mm-hmm.
you can sue, the address particularly to that government agency,
Mm-hmm.
but the agents,
Right.
the people who are carrying out the government's job procedure, the people who are executing on behalf of the government, they have been protected from frivolous lawsuits. Now, of course, there are exceptions, and it pretty much the exceptions are generally, like, did you violate constitutional law, and did you know it? And was this a constitutional? Did you know it at the time that you violated constitutional law? And did you also know that the courts set a precedent to say, yeah, that's wrong? And a precedent just means like when the Supreme Court says it's wrong for you to allow a canine to bite a person while they're laying on the ground.
Right.
If the court specifically says that, then now, so we know that you have violated constitutional law because it's excessive, and we know the court specifically stated that, now you could be sued.
You can be sued. Yeah.
Versus it being, and so that makes the process really difficult, because now that it makes that it had to have already been gone through the judicial system before they can apply this law.
Right.
So qualified immunity is in need of some clarification. To start, the U.S. section is 18 U.S.C. section 242. And what they want to do, they want to change the language in that section from the willingness to commit police misconduct to a recklessness.
Yep.
To police misconduct.
Mm-hmm.
Willingness is very difficult to prove, right? So why did you sign up for police and CBC?
So the reason I got into policing, like I said before, was to actually help my community.
To
be a force in the community.
Yeah.
Somebody that has a seat at that table.
Wow. See, okay, great. So then by nature of you filling out, and that is not just you.
Right.
That is many police officers who genuinely have a heart for the job.
Mm-hmm.
Sidebar.
Mm-hmm.
When we talk about the health of police officers,
Yes.
Research showed that officers were interviewed their first year in the department, and they ask a specific set of questions. And then they'll interview them in the next 5 years on the department. Right. Then they're interviewing in that year 15. And they'll ask them similar questions in a different way. But what they'll do is they will show them the tape from the previous 5 years.
Right. And
it shows that mindset, unfortunately, sometimes changes as to why you do this job.
Right.
Or even if you see the same words, the nonverbal or the tone that you use, it's a little bit different.
Yep.
And it's a subtle reminder of like how officers may or may not be changing over time.
Right.
And so I say that to say that like a lot of officers start wanting to, and they intend to want to help people, but sometimes through not really taking care of themselves or going through trauma, they no longer are at that point.
Right.
So that is when I say that, because I'm not going to classify every officer as someone who is unwilling to help people. But imagine being a prosecutor you have to go before a jury of 12 people in a trial, and you have to prove that this officer was willingly committing this police misconduct,
Right.
whether excessive force or lethal or some lethal force. So we're talking about just by signing the application, you have now determined that you are going to be in public service.
Right.
You have now determined that you're going to protect and serve. When those juries think about the position of police, they think about the risk we put ourselves in,
Right.
the threat, the protecting the service. Just by signing your name on the application before you even get the job, people are assuming that you are willing to help.
To help. Right. And put your life on the line if need be.
Yeah.
That is an assumption. The assumption of risk.
Yeah.
By signing your name on that application.
And so when you sign your name on that application, you already have the benefit of the doubt. Now, if you have a history, or if you've been in an department long enough, you can show where you've been willing and demonstrate your willingness to help the community. And then you finally get to this point where you're in court and you're being accused of police misconduct. Now the prosecutor has to prove that if you willingly did this, the willfulness of it. Now the prosecutor has to prove, in a sense, that you have criminal intent.
That you had intent from the beginning, from the start.
That's a high burden.
A high bar.
That's a high bar. And if that is a high bar, that is really hard to prove that this police officer all of a sudden out of nowhere became this rogue agent who decided that they wanted to take out the citizens that they swore to protect and serve. That's an impossible standard. You just really can't. It's just ineffective. And then if you already have a judge who's been appointed by a Republican official who tends to lean to be more supportive of police,
right,
you're going to have an even harder time convincing that judge that you have provided enough evidence that this person was willingly shooting this citizen.
Right.
Like for instance, the George Floyd situation, that's easy to prove, right? He was on his neck. The guy said he wasn't breathing. Citizens were saying he was breathing. It looked willful. He did not any opportunity to try to assist him with his medical help. But unfortunately, if you're dealing with a situation where an officer is saying that if somebody drew a gun or he perceived somebody to have a weapon at that time, and when the courts look at this, they're not saying, what did the officer think at the time? They're saying, what would any person look back on the situation and think, how would they respond in that moment?
Right.
And when they do that, they're going to easily say, well, yeah, this guy, he didn't just want to walk. He didn't intend. He didn't willfully walk in there and kill somebody. He perceived this person was a threat to him. That's a huge difference. That is a huge difference between being willful and being reckless.
Yep.
Now, reckless is different.
Yep.
Reckless is pretty much like, it doesn't matter if you intended to kill that person or not. It matters that or how you did it.
How you did it, right.
Not what you intended to do.
Right. What were your actions against a policy that was promulgated by your department?
Oh, hold on. All right, doctor. Promulgated. We got to get you a paper to write or something, man. You over here dropping these big P words. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that is key. So when we look at qualified immunity, think about like these old monarchies, right? It's a qualified immunity is a lesser form than absolute immunity. Absolute immunity is a cousin to the concept of the absolute monarchy. And when you were brought before the king's court in an absolute monarchy, you couldn't sue the king because the king was looked at as divine. Right? He was the ruler. He had the final word because he was placed in that position of authority. And what the king said was. But as the country moved away from monarchies and we moved toward democracies and we felt like these people weren't divine appointed, they were elected.
Right.
Then we started saying, okay, well, let's kind of reduce it and go to a form of qualified immunity where you can sue the government, but it has to be because they actually tried to wrong you,
right? Not
because they made a mistake. Right. Or not because, and to limit any frivolous lawsuits.
Right.
So now you have this ability for a citizen to say, hey, government, and honestly, like 99.98% of the time, when an officer is like considered to be wrong or even terminated, and the city is ultimately the one that's paying the
It's
fee,
paying the cost.
paying the cost,
Yeah.
or paying the court costs and fines,
Mhm.
the damages, or however you want to phrase it. And in doing so, even if the officer is sued, the officer is never paying the full price.
Right.
Not only that, but it's the officers really couldn't afford whatever you're probably now. Granted, they couldn't afford, from a singular or a linear perspective, they couldn't afford with their current occupation as a police officer.
Right.
Now, yeah, everybody has a different background. Some people have family, trust and wills that left them in a high, better financial situation. But if you're taking an officer off their just monetary gains and their monetary possessions just off of policing, we're talking about not even having the money for a 6-figure lawsuit,
Right.
let alone
Yeah.
in the millions.
7, 8, 8 figures.
You know what I mean? So the reality of it is even if you can sue officers,
There's nothing.
what are you going to really get from
Yeah.
them?
There's nothing at the end of that rope.
Yeah, I
Nothing
mean,
there.
it's almost like, I'm not, I don't say that to discourage people from suing them,
Right.
because you still can be sued and
Yeah.
you could just have to make payments, for the rest of your life. But I think the ultimate goal would be I understand the concept of suing the entity, especially if you're looking for a return.
Right.
But I say that to say that being able to sue officers will provide more of a personal liability to address maybe it's not the department, maybe it's just that officer issue. But what you're going to get from the officers is going to be interesting in and of itself.
Right.
And that's something that's in question at this point. But when you look at the history of qualified immunity, we're talking about the ability for courts now. Courts apparently, there have been several cases. It started off in with Pearson versus Ray in 1967 when they introduced qualified immunity, and they enacted it, pretty much protecting law enforcement and officials from frivolous lawsuits. And that's when it was first introduced in the court. And then it had to be addressed again in Harlow versus Fitzgerald in 1982, where that's where they established the 2-step standard of that it had to be the law had to be, the officer, in order for him to be protected, had to be acting in good faith, and it had to be objectively reasonable. So operating in good faith means that he had best of intentions, and objectively reasonable means think about it as what it's opposed to, and that is the subjective thinking. In other words, it's instead of me thinking about trying to figure out his mindset during the course of the incident and figure out whether he intended to or not, that will be the subjective standard. The objectively reasonable standard is, what would any person do at that time? How would any person react to it at that time? So it makes the burden, it puts the burden on the person suing the officer versus the officer himself in that moment.
Right. Having to prove that he did not have this ill intent.
Correct. And when you think about the times that these laws were passed in this way and the politics of it, it's not a surprise when you tend to see these laws kind of made to protect police officers. Where do you stand on qualified immunity?
I think qualified immunity is a good thing in that it does not give the officer a blanket right to go out and do whatever the heck he or she wants to do. It still makes them have to think about what they do. But at the same time, when they do everything right, it stops them from, losing their livelihood.
Do you think that requiring an officer to not be reckless is too high of a standard?
No, because all of the training that an officer goes to before he even gets put on the streets, and that's another podcast that we will talk, that we'll get into, what training is. All of the training that an officer has to go through, not only initially, but throughout their career, should prevent that recklessness.
Yeah, I agree. But the recklessness do you think the recklessness is the perception of the recklessness?
Perception by
citizens? Because what may be deemed reckless to a citizen
right
may not be deemed reckless to the officer.
That's right. So one part of objective reasonableness is what would a objective officer feel about the actions of that officer,
Yeah.
not what the citizen who is not trained.
Well, it does include the citizen,
But it includes the citizen.
but they try to view it through the officer's eyes.
Right.
You know, it's like,
And that's kind of sort of hard to do.
that's really hard to do. And I think like that's a lot of what we see. And I think that unfortunately, and this is something that probably we don't talk about enough, is the police department's lacking trust in the community.
Right.
I think the community doesn't trust the police department, but I think there are police departments that don't trust the community.
Right.
And I think that is a, you know, whether it comes from being unable to identify the community, not really being invested in the community, feeling like the community is against policing.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, a lot of officers may be against citizens' use of force review boards,
Right.
because they may not trust the citizens' understanding of the law,
Right.
or that they'll be able to rule out a personal bias when it comes to establishing whether or not there was a violation.
Right.
So yeah, that is a huge thing, and I do feel like there's that trust factor. But to go back to what you were saying is that, yeah, I do believe that it can be a difficult thing for a citizen to see. Do you think that it will lead to frivolous lawsuits?
I don't think that it would lead to frivolous lawsuits, because frivolous lawsuits are already there.
Okay.
So I don't think it's going to lead to anything.
More. Yeah, like not any more frivolous lawsuits.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think that with the judiciary's, or I'm sorry, the House's bill,
Mm-hmm.
I think there's going to be more of an onus put on the government to teach citizens about use of force, what constitutes use of force, why is this officer allowed to do. So I think that as this thing proceeds, and hopefully, I'm with you. I'm hoping that one day that, you know, the House has already passed it, that the Senate can get on board and pass some version, and they can get on the president's desk to be signed into law.
Because this is a major disagreement point.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
Like this is what they're arguing over. They'll take the data.
Yeah.
You know, they'll take the no choking. They'll take the no knock warrants. But when it comes to this qualified immunity,
Yes. It's like, no.
Yeah.
Let's not put your hands on that, because
Yeah,
you're going to lose officers.
Yeah.
I don't think you're necessarily going to lose officers.
well, you're going to lose the officers that can afford to go.
Yeah.
Now, and that's a different that is this conversation. Like, we're talking about officers who have the ability to retire at any point in time.
Right.
We're talking about officers who don't necessarily need policing, and or officers who have the ability to go. And I guess I can hear the average citizen saying, like, well, that's perfect. Let them leave.
Yeah, let them leave.
Like, you know, I mean, what's the, you know, that would be solving half the problem right there.
Yeah,
The people
but at the same time, you're not backfilling
right.
those
And there is
positions.
significant manpower. And I think the biggest concern that we have is that, as from a blue perspective, from a law enforcement perspective is it's difficult now to determine when and when not to pull the trigger.
Right.
It's not like it's not just like, you know, you kind of think this out. You kind of are trained, like, okay, was there a perceived threat? Or are there ways that I can prevent this threat from even occurring? And if it does occur, how do I respond to it? But, and if it does occur, how can I respond to it? But if there is anything that officers are concerned about, is now I'm gonna have people in the department who are hesitant to use force when they should,
Right.
and now we're leading to more officer deaths.
Right.
And I think the goal is not to save Black lives by killing police officers.
Right.
You know what I mean? I think the goal is for more people to live together peacefully.
Right.
So with that being said, I think that that is another thing. Like, we don't want people afraid that they're going to make a mistake, even if they're not. Just the fear that they're going to make a mistake is an issue. So I see it. I definitely understand both sides. I think that the recklessness in and of itself, there's different levels of recklessness.
Yeah.
Right. Just like you have, like, just like you got different levels of homicide, right?
Right.
You got first degree, second degree, and then you also have like voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter, right? And so, and now they all could be called different things. Some call it maiming, some call it, unlawful homicide, whatever you want to call it. But just a general rule. And what we know, the difference between a voluntary manslaughter and a involuntary manslaughter is involuntary manslaughter is recklessness.
Right.
Voluntary manslaughter is gross recklessness.
Yeah.
In a sense that like recklessness is like, oh, it could have happened to anybody, right? Like, recklessness could be something as simple as like, I forgot to close the trunk of my car, and then my tool fell out of my car, hit somebody who was either walking or driving,
And
so
it hurt them.
yeah, and it hurt them. So now or it killed them,
Right.
and now somebody wants to charge you for being reckless and not properly shutting your trunk of your car or strapping down your equipment, because especially if you can tie that with like some type of traffic violation. Now, on the other hand, gross negligence is I get out of my car before I put it in park,
Right.
and I have it directing towards you, and somebody gets in a car accident, or instead of the tool flying out of my trunk, I throw it out of my window,
Right.
as if it's like just not going to land up, or like if I'm New Year's Eve or New Year's Day or July 4th, and I'm shooting gunshots in the air, and what goes up must come down, and with similar velocity, and unfortunately that bullet that might have cost somebody their life now comes back traced to a firearm that person owns. That can be a form of gross negligence as well.
Right.
So the question is will officers have that same kind of standard? You know what I mean? It's like, what will they be able to offer them? So that's what we're waiting to see, and see how they handle it.
And see what comes about of this.
Yeah. So keep your eyes glued. Politics are going on.
Yeah.
It's election season. So, if you listen to this months from now, when this is put out, you'll probably have more answers than the questions we have. But this has been a pleasure. We're going to wrap up our qualified immunity breakdown from the Justice and Policing Act. CVC, thank you for joining us.
Oh, yes, sir. It's been a pleasure every time.
Thank you for having us. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, make sure you like us and subscribe and follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and Instagram. And we have our snippets on there. Check us out, share us, get the word out, man. We are here to try to just help people understand each other from the Black and Blue community and really push this reconciliation between the groups forward. So again, thank y'all for joining us. Be blessed.
Yep. Y'all have a good week.
Yeah.